The day had started like any other. The sun stretched its golden arms across the quiet suburban neighborhood, washing over neatly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes lined up in perfect rows. Our street looked peaceful, almost too perfect, the kind of place where every curtain was ironed and every flower bed approved by the HOA. Inside our home, though, life was anything but picture-perfect. The sound of laughter echoed from upstairs, where my teenage son was hanging out with a few friends. They weren't loud enough to disturb anyone, not by normal standards at least, but in this neighborhood, normal didn't count. The HOA here measured everything on its own scale, and trust me, that scale was tilted. I was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, trying to savor the calm before the inevitable storm. Because with this HOA, there was always a storm. My son, Alex, had always been a good kid. 16 years old, sharp, respectful, never the type to break rules just for the thrill of it. He'd been through enough challenges to know that trouble wasn't worth chasing. But to the HOA, he was guilty the moment he turned into a teenager. In their eyes, he wasn't a young man. He was a potential disturbance. That morning, his friends had come over. A couple of older guys he'd met through a youth mentorship program. They carried themselves differently than the average neighbor. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, almost military. Their builds were muscular, disciplined, but they treated Alex with the kind of respect that made me proud. They weren't rowdy. They weren't reckless. They were calm, focused. Still, the HOA wouldn't see it that way. They never did. As I rinsed my mug, I glanced out the window. Across the street, behind a lace curtain, I caught the unmistakable shadow of Mrs. Henderson, the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog. Her head bobbed like a pigeon, scanning left and right, scribbling in her little notepad. No one had elected her as anything, but she had taken it upon herself to be the neighborhood spy. And when Mrs. Henderson saw something she didn't understand, she reported it. I sighed. It was only a matter of time before the phone rang or a notice showed up on the door. Upstairs, Alex's laughter boomed again, followed by the deeper chuckle of one of his guests. I smiled. There was something about the sound that felt safe, even grounding. These men weren't just friends, they were role models. And while the HOA saw suspicious visitors, I saw guidance, brotherhood, a reminder that Alex was surrounding himself with people who would lift him higher, not drag him down. The quiet moment broke when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly ring. It was sharp, insistent, the kind that screamed, "Problem." I set down the mug and walked to the door, already bracing myself. Sure enough, when I opened it, there stood Mrs. Henderson, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tight they looked glued together. Her eyes darted past me into the house, scanning for evidence of wrongdoing. "Good morning," I said flatly. She didn't bother with greetings. "Do you know what's going on in your home right now?" I raised an eyebrow. "My son's upstairs with his friends. They're fine." Her nostrils flared. "They're not fine. There are strange men coming and going. Big, intimidating types. The whole neighborhood is talking about it. This isn't a safe environment for families." I clenched my jaw. "Mrs. Henderson, they're his mentors. They've done more good for him than this HOA ever has." Her pen scratched against the clipboard. "I'll be reporting this to the board. You'll be hearing from us." I almost laughed. "When do I not?" She huffed, spun on her heel and marched away. The door clicked shut behind me, and I exhaled. Alex appeared on the stairs, curiosity in his eyes. "HOA again?" he asked. "Who else?" I muttered. He shook his head, rolling his eyes with the kind of weary acceptance only a teenager under an HOA could have. "She doesn't get it, Dad. These guys aren't trouble." "I know, son, but the HOA never sees people. They only see problems." And as the day went on, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my gut, because if Mrs. Henderson was already sniffing around, it meant the board wasn't far behind. And with this HOA, a knock on the door wasn't the end of trouble. It was the beginning. The afternoon sun was slipping lower, shadows stretching across driveways, when the sound of tires crunching against asphalt reached my ears. Not just one car, several. I stepped to the window and froze. Black and white cruisers rolled to a stop in front of my house, lights flashing silently. Doors opened. Officers stepped out, hands resting on holsters. My heart sank. The HOA had gone too far this time. I turned back toward the stairs. Alex's voice echoed from above, light-hearted, unaware of what was waiting outside. The Navy SEALs he looked up to were still with him, calm as stone. But outside my home, the HOA had just declared war. And they had no idea who they were really up against. The flashing lights outside weren't a surprise. Not really. With this HOA, surprises weren't sudden. They were inevitable. To understand why those patrol cars had rolled up to my driveway, you'd have to understand the history of the people who ruled our neighborhood like tyrants with clipboards. Our subdivision had been built barely a decade ago, marketed as a model community. Manicured lawns, perfect fences, a pristine community pool. The brochure made it look like paradise. But paradise came with a price. And in this case, that price was the Homeowners Association. From the very beginning, the HOA had insisted that everything be uniform. Lawns no higher than 3 inches. No vehicles parked on the street overnight. Trash cans out only between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Not a minute longer. It didn't matter if you were a busy parent, a retiree, or a teenager with a basketball hoop on the curb. Rules were rules. And if you broke them, fines, letters, harassment. They called themselves protectors of property value. We called them something else entirely. At the center of it all was the board president, Mrs. Karen Henderson. Yes, that Mrs. Henderson. She'd lived in the neighborhood the longest, and she wore that fact like a crown. With her perfect bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and collection of pastel cardigans, she looked like a picture from a suburban magazine. But beneath the pearls and perfume was a woman who thrived on control. Karen didn't just enforce the rules. She invented them. Last year, she had pushed for a no basketball hoops ordinance because they make the neighborhood look messy. She got rid of backyard sheds because they could attract vermin. She even banned American flags larger than a certain size because they were distracting. And she didn't stop at writing rules. She patrolled. Every morning, like clockwork, she walked the neighborhood with her clipboard, peeking over fences and into garages, scribbling notes with the intensity of a detective solving a crime. No violation was too small. No resident was too innocent. From the day we moved in, we were on her radar. First, it was the grass. A patch near the mailbox had turned yellow during a dry spell. Within 48 hours, we had a violation notice taped to the front door. Unkempt lawn. Immediate action required. Then it was the basketball hoop. Alex had set it up on the driveway just like any other kid. Within a week, Karen herself came knocking. "This isn't allowed," she said, tapping her clipboard. "You'll need to remove it immediately. It lowers the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal." "It's a basketball hoop," I'd argued. "He's a kid. He needs somewhere to play." "Then take him to the community gym," she'd snapped. Rules are rules. We didn't back down. We fought the fine, kept the hoop for a while, but eventually, after threats of legal action, we had to give in. And that was just the beginning. Noise complaints followed. Trash cans reported. Even the shade of paint we'd chosen for the shutters was deemed too bold and not in line with community standards. Every small act of living was treated like rebellion, and Karen thrived on it. When Alex became a teenager, things only got worse. In Karen's eyes, teenagers were dangerous by default. Too loud, too reckless, too alive. She'd glare whenever Alex rode his bike down the street. She reported him for skateboarding, claiming he was endangering property. One summer, he and his friends set up a lemonade stand. Within an hour, Karen shut it down. "Unlicensed business," she'd said with a smirk. Alex tried to shrug it off, but I could see the toll it took. Being treated like a criminal in your own neighborhood isn't easy, especially when all you want is a normal childhood. And Karen wasn't done. When Alex started bringing home his mentors, the Navy SEALs, Karen nearly lost her mind. She didn't see decorated servicemen. She didn't see discipline, honor, or role models. She saw strange men in her precious subdivision. Outsiders. Threats. The first time she spotted them, She snapped photos from across the street. The second time, she called a board meeting. By the third, she was demanding investigation into suspicious activities at the residence of Lot 42. Lot 42, that was us. And when Karen didn't get immediate action from her fellow board members, she took matters into her own hands. She called the police. I remembered clearly the smug expression on her face when those cruisers rolled up. She stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, chin raised, acting like she had single-handedly saved the neighborhood. "This is the house," she declared loudly, pointing at us. "Suspicious activity. Dangerous individuals. I demand you investigate." The neighbors gathered, whispering, some curious, some entertained. They didn't care about truth, they wanted a show. And Karen? She was giving them one. Standing inside, watching the flashing lights stain the walls, I realized something chilling. Karen and the HOA didn't care about safety. They didn't care about community. They cared about control, about winning, about making examples out of anyone who dared live differently. To them, my son wasn't a kid spending time with mentors. He was a problem, an eyesore, a reminder that their power wasn't absolute. And if they had to call the police to prove it, they would, without hesitation. But here's what Karen didn't know. Alex's mentors weren't just any men. They weren't troublemakers, they weren't criminals, and they definitely weren't afraid of HOA boards or police sirens. They were Navy SEALs, disciplined, calm, trained for storms far bigger than this. And while Karen thought she was about to win another battle in her petty suburban war, she was about to find herself in the middle of a fight she couldn't even comprehend. The trouble really began with the whispers. In neighborhoods like ours, gossip spread faster than wildfire. And once the HOA lit the spark, it didn't take long for the flames to catch. First, it was little things. A neighbor mentioned a lot of traffic at our house lately. Another claimed they'd seen strange men with tattoos, carrying duffel bags up our driveway. By the time the stories made it back to the HOA board, they'd morphed into full-blown rumors. Drug deals, gang meetings, weapons stashed in our basement. All of it was nonsense. But in Karen's hands, nonsense became evidence. Every afternoon I could spot them. Mrs. Henderson at her window, peering through those lace curtains like a hawk. Mr. Dalton pretending to water his lawn for 30 minutes straight while angling himself toward our driveway. Even kids had been roped into it, riding their bikes up and down the street reporting who went in and out of our front door. The neighborhood had become a stage, and our house was the main act. One evening, Alex came into the kitchen with a frown. "Dad," he said, "I think someone's taking pictures of me." I looked up sharply. "Where?" "Across the street," he muttered, jerking his chin toward Henderson's house. "Every time I step outside, I see her curtains move. Yesterday, when I walked to my car, I heard the click of a camera. I gritted my teeth. She's documenting, building a case." "For what?" he asked. "Existing." His frustration stung because he wasn't wrong. That week, the HOA held one of their infamous board meetings. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, discussions about paint colors, fines for weeds, debates about whether Christmas lights should come down by January 2nd. But this one was different. Karen called it an emergency session. Neighbors packed the community hall, eager for scandal. Standing at the front, clipboard in hand, she delivered her case like a prosecutor in court. "Residents," she began, her voice sharp and theatrical. "We have a problem at Lot 42. Unusual activity. Strange visitors. Men loitering at all hours. This is not the kind of behavior that aligns with our community's values." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. "I've witnessed it myself," she continued, "and I have statements from at least 3 neighbors who confirm suspicious comings and goings." "Suspicious how?" someone asked. Karen's lips tightened. "Tattoos, military-style bags, parking without permits, young people loitering on the lawn." Another voice piped up. "Could just be friends visiting." Karen's glare silenced them. "This isn't about friendship. It's about safety. If we don't act, our neighborhood could become a target for crime. Drugs, violence, who knows what else." She paused for dramatic effect. I propose we escalate this to law enforcement. Immediately, the board murmured, flipping through their bylaws like scripture. Most nodded along. Some hesitated, but no one wanted to oppose Karen publicly. She had a way of turning dissenters into outcasts. Within minutes, the vote was cast. Unanimous. Lot 42 was under investigation, and Karen was the hero leading the charge. After that, the scrutiny intensified. I couldn't step outside without feeling eyes on me. Cars slowed as they passed. A drone even buzzed overhead one evening, lingering too long above our backyard before zipping off toward Dalton's house. Alex tried to shrug it off, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. His mentors noticed it too. One of them, a tall man named Chris, leaned against the counter one afternoon, arms crossed. Your neighbors always this nosy? Worse, I muttered. They're organized. Chris exchanged a look with the others, quiet, calm, professional. They didn't rattle easily, but even they were unsettled by the constant surveillance. It all came to a head one Saturday evening. Alex and his friends were in the garage, working out with some equipment the SEALs had brought over. They weren't blasting music, they weren't breaking rules, just training. But to Karen, it looked like military drills. She marched straight to the curb, phone in hand, recording every second. This is unacceptable, she shouted. This is a residential neighborhood, not a training camp. Alex ignored her, focusing on his reps. That only enraged her further. You'll regret this, she hissed, storming off toward her house. I'm calling the police. That night, the call went through. Karen's voice, shrill and urgent, painted a picture of chaos. Suspicious men, dangerous, weapons, teenagers endangered. Immediate response required. The dispatcher, hearing the words, dangerous men and weapons, didn't brush it off. They logged it as a potential threat. Within minutes, cruisers were dispatched. It started with sirens in the distance. Low at first, then louder. Blue and red lights flickered against the walls, growing brighter with each second. Alex came downstairs, confusion etched on his face. What's going on? I peeked through the blinds. 3 police cars had pulled up outside. Officers stepped out cautiously, hands near their holsters, scanning the house like they expected a shootout. Behind them, Karen stood smug at the curb, arms folded, neighbors clustering around her like she'd just won a prize. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was an ambush. The SEALs stayed calm. Chris stood by the window watching. Another, Jake, leaned casually against the wall, but his eyes were sharp, tracking every movement outside. They called cops on us? Alex asked, his voice rising. They don't know who you are, I said quietly. Jake smirked. They're about to find out. Through the window, I watched Karen march up to the lead officer, waving her clipboard like a sword. That's the house, she barked. That's where the criminals are hiding. I demand you go inside and take them out. The officer frowned. Ma'am, we need to handle this professionally. Professionally? She snapped. Do your job. Protect this neighborhood. We pay taxes for this. The neighbors murmured in agreement. Phones raised, recording every angle. This wasn't just law enforcement anymore. It was theater, and Karen was loving every second. As I stood in the living room, watching the flashing lights stain our walls blue and red, one thought burned in my mind. The HOA thought they were staging a takedown. But in truth, they were staging their own humiliation. Because once the Navy SEALs stepped outside, calm and unshaken, the entire story would flip upside down. The sirens cut off, leaving only the pulsing flash of blue and red outside. My heart thudded in my chest as the police cruisers settled into position, angled to block the street like they were staging a raid. Neighbors crowded the sidewalks, whispering eagerly, phones raised to capture every second. And there, at the center of it all, stood Karen Henderson. Arms folded, chin high, smug as a queen addressing her court. To her, this wasn't just another complaint. This was victory. 3 uniformed officers stepped out of their cars. They were young, steady, cautious. Their eyes scanned the house, their hands hovering near their holsters, tension visible in their shoulders. One of them, a tall officer with a square jaw, lifted his radio. "Dispatch, we've arrived at the location. Multiple civilians outside. House under suspicion." Suspicion. My fists clenched at the word. That's all this was. Suspicion twisted into evidence by a bored HOA queen with too much power. The lead officer raised a hand toward the crowd. "Everyone stay back. Please remain on the sidewalks." The neighbors didn't move far. If anything, they pressed closer, eager to see the action. Karen strode forward like she'd been waiting her whole life for this spotlight. Clipboard in hand, she waved at the house with theatrical flair. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This is the residence I reported. Lot 42. My neighborhood has been under siege for weeks by suspicious activity. Strange men coming and going at all hours, intimidating the residents. My neighbors and I fear for our safety." Her words rippled through the crowd like poison. People gasped, muttered, nodded along. Some didn't even know what they were agreeing with, they just liked the drama. The officer frowned. "Ma'am, we'll handle this. Please stand aside." But Karen wasn't one to give up the microphone once she had it. "No, you don't understand," she pressed on. "There are dangerous men inside that home. I saw them carrying bags, heavy bags, military-looking equipment. They've been training in the garage like some kind of militia. You must go in immediately and arrest them before it's too late." Her voice cracked with fake urgency, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She wasn't afraid. She was excited. From behind the blinds, I watched it unfold. Alex stood beside me, fists clenched, his face tight with anger. "They're talking about Chris and Jake," he whispered. "About my friends." "I know," I said softly. "Stay calm." Behind him, the SEALs remained composed. Chris, tall and broad-shouldered, stood with his arms crossed, gaze steady. Jake leaned against the wall, calm as stone. They weren't rattled by flashing lights or the roar of authority outside. They'd seen worse, much worse. Chris glanced at me. "This is going to get messy before it gets better." I nodded grimly. They don't know who they're dealing with. A knock thundered at the door, sharp and commanding. "Police, open up." I took a deep breath and opened it slowly. The lead officer stood there, posture stiff but professional. Behind him, Karen hovered, trying to crane her neck past him into the house. "Sir," the officer began, "we received multiple reports of suspicious activity here. Can we step inside and ask you a few questions?" Karen cut in before I could answer. "Don't just ask questions. Arrest them. Search the house. Do your jobs." The officer shot her a look that said not now, but she didn't take the hint. She practically buzzed with self-importance, as if she were the commander giving orders. I steadied my voice. "Officers, there's no suspicious activity here. My son has friends visiting. That's all." Karen scoffed so loud half the neighborhood heard. "Friends? Dangerous criminals, more like, look at them." She pointed dramatically through the window at Chris, who hadn't moved from his spot. The officer's eyes flicked to him, his brow furrowed. Chris's calm, unwavering stance seemed to confuse him. It didn't scream criminal. It screamed trained. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, I do need to verify what's going on here. Could you have everyone step outside for a moment?" Before I could reply, Karen shoved forward, jabbing her clipboard like a weapon. "Yes, get them outside. You'll see what I've been telling you. They're dangerous. They don't belong here. Arrest them now before they hurt someone." The crowd murmured louder. Phones zoomed in. The spectacle was growing. I looked back at Chris. He gave the faintest nod, then motioned to Jake. Without a word, both men stepped forward. Their movements were smooth, deliberate, calm, not defiant but commanding. When they stepped into the doorway, the air shifted. The officers straightened instinctively, sensing the discipline in the way these men carried themselves. The crowd gasped. Karen's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "There," she shrieked. See? Look at them. Tattoos, muscles, bags of who knows what. They're clearly up to no good. Get the cuffs on them already. The lead officer held up a hand, silencing Karen. His eyes narrowed at Chris. Sir, he said cautiously, can you identify yourself? Chris didn't flinch. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, the movement precise, deliberate, the kind of movement trained men make to avoid misunderstandings. When his wallet flipped open, the golden glint of federal credentials caught the flashing lights outside. I'm Petty Officer Christopher Hale, he said calmly. United States Navy SEALs. These are my teammates. We're visiting family friends. And you, officer, are dangerously close to escalating a false report. The crowd erupted in gasps. Karen's jaw dropped. The officer blinked, momentarily stunned, before quickly regaining composure. Navy SEALs? He echoed, as if testing the words for himself. Chris gave a single, firm nod. Karen tried to jump in, her voice desperate now. No, don't believe him. That's fake. He's lying. They're lying. But no one was listening to her anymore. The officers weren't looking at Karen. They were staring at the badges, at the calm, authoritative stance of the men in front of them. And for the first time that night, the power shifted. The neighbors whispered frantically. Navy SEALs? Are you serious? I knew they weren't criminals. Karen's done for this time. Karen's face went red, then pale, then red again. She sputtered, tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Chris's calm voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Officer, I suggest you consider the consequences of allowing unfounded harassment by this HOA. My friend's here, and I don't take kindly to being treated like criminals in our own country. The officer swallowed, nodded. His radio crackled at his side, but he didn't respond. For a moment, it felt like the entire block had gone silent, waiting for the next move. Karen had wanted a spectacle, and she had one, but not the kind she'd imagined, because the world had just learned the truth, and the HOA was about to pay for it. For a moment, the entire street froze. The golden glint of Chris's credentials hung in the air like lightning. The officers were processing it. The neighbors were whispering frantically, and Karen, oh Karen, stood stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But if there's one thing I knew about her, it was this: Karen never accepted defeat. Not quietly, recovering faster than I expected. She jabbed her clipboard toward Chris again, her voice shrill with desperation. Don't you see? That's what makes it worse. They're military. They're dangerous. What kind of neighborhood lets Navy SEALs hide out in a family home? This isn't safe for children. For families. The crowd murmured uneasily. Some shook their heads at her. Others chuckled under their breath. A teenager in the back whispered, Lady, they are the safe ones. Earning stifled laughter from his friends. The lead officer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. But Karen wasn't finished. She raised her voice louder, projecting like she was at a town hall debate. You think credentials mean anything? Anyone can print a badge. They're probably mercenaries, criminals, posing as Navy SEALs to trick you. And this man, she pointed at me now, her eyes blazing, is harboring them. It's a conspiracy against our community. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. The temptation to snap back was strong, but I knew better. With people like Karen, silence burned hotter than fire. The lead officer lifted a hand. Ma'am, that's enough. We've seen the identification. These men are legitimate. Karen's face flushed red. Legitimate? Do you even know how easy it is to buy costumes and badges on the internet? This is my neighborhood. I know what's best for it. And I say they don't belong. The officer's patience was thinning. Ma'am, please step aside and let us do our job. But Karen wasn't capable of stepping aside. Not physically, not emotionally. She thrived on control. And tonight, with half the neighborhood watching, she couldn't bear to lose her grip. Whispers spread through the crowd, growing bolder now. She's lost it. Calling the cops on Navy SEALs? What is she thinking? Imagine embarrassing yourself like this. Phones zoomed in. Red recording lights glowed in the dusk. This wasn't just drama anymore, it was spectacle. Karen was trending in real time, and she knew it. Her eyes darted to the phones, panic flickering beneath the fury. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice shriller, her gestures wilder. You're all blind. They're manipulating you. You'll regret this when something terrible happens. Mark my words. For the first time, Alex stepped forward. His fists were clenched, his voice steady but strong. Mrs. Henderson, he said, these men are my friends. They're not criminals. They've done more for me than you ever have. The crowd hushed. Karen's eyes snapped to him, narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. You, she hissed. You're the reason this neighborhood is falling apart. Teenagers with no respect, sneaking around with suspicious men. Do you think we don't see you? You're a danger. You're corrupting this community. Alex's jaw tightened. I'm not corrupting anything. I'm learning from them. They're teaching me discipline, respect, things you wouldn't understand. Gasps rippled through the neighbors. Karen sputtered, caught off guard by the boy she thought she could intimidate. Chris's calm voice cut through the tension. Ma'am, let me be very clear. We don't answer to you. We answer to a higher duty, one you'll never understand standing behind a clipboard. If you think you can intimidate us, you're mistaken. The authority in his tone silenced the crowd. Even the officers straightened, as if reminded of the hierarchy of respect. Karen, however, trembled with rage. How dare you speak to me like that? I'm the HOA president. I have power here. Chris didn't flinch. Power? You called in the police on your own community. That's not power. That's paranoia. The words hit her like a slap. Her face contorted, red and pale all at once. Karen's voice rose to a scream. You don't belong here. None of you. If the police won't remove you, I will. And then, to everyone's shock, she lunged forward. The officers reacted instantly, stepping between her and the SEALs. One officer grabbed her arm gently but firmly. Ma'am, that's enough. You're bordering on obstruction. Karen yanked against his grip, screeching. Let me go. They're criminals. Arrest them. Arrest him. She pointed at Alex again, eyes wild. The crowd gasped. Children clung to their parents. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. She wasn't just embarrassing herself now. She was unraveling. The lead officer's voice boomed, louder than hers, silencing the street. Ma'am, this is your final warning. Step back. Right now. Karen froze. Her chest heaved. Her eyes darted around the crowd, searching for support. But where she once commanded whispers of agreement, now she found only disgust, pity, or amusement. No one was on her side. Not anymore. She tried to salvage it. I was protecting the neighborhood. I was keeping everyone safe. The officer shook his head. No, ma'am. You made a false report. You wasted police resources. You endangered innocent people. That's not safety. That's harassment. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. As the officers guided her back toward the curb, the neighbors' whispers grew louder, bolder. She's finished. Can you believe this? I'm sending this video to the news. Karen stumbled, her composure shattered. She tried to lift her chin, to reclaim her dignity, but the glow of dozens of phone screens reflected her downfall. And then came the sound that broke her completely. Applause. It started with one person, then another, until the whole block erupted in claps and cheers. Not for her, but for the men she'd tried to destroy. Chris and Jake stood tall, calm, unshaken, their presence radiating authority. Alex stood beside them, proud, shoulders squared. And me? I knew in that moment the story had flipped. Karen had set the stage for our humiliation. Instead, she'd written her own. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Karen would lick her wounds, plot her revenge, and try to twist the narrative again. The HOA always did. But the truth was out now. The whole neighborhood had seen who the real danger was, and it wasn't the men inside Lot 42. It was the woman outside, clutching a clipboard like it was a crown, blinded by her own need for control. And her reign? It was crumbling, while the chaos outside unfolded. Neighbors whispering, officers tense, and Karen screeching about conspiracies. The truth of who stood in my living room deserved to be told. Because the men she'd labeled criminals weren't random visitors. They weren't drifters or mercenaries. They were family in a way Karen would never understand. It started a year earlier. Alex had been struggling, caught in that in-between place all teenagers go through. Too old to be a kid, too young to be taken seriously. He'd lost focus. His grades slipped. His confidence dipped. And the constant harassment from the HOA didn't help. Every time Karen scolded him or threatened a fine over his skateboard, I saw a little more frustration in his eyes. I worried about him. I wanted him to have role models, real ones. That's when fate stepped in. One afternoon, Alex was shooting hoops at the local rec center when a group of men joined in. Big men, muscular, tattooed, sharp-eyed. But when they played, they weren't intimidating, they were patient, encouraging. They laughed, coached him, passed him the ball. Those men? Off-duty Navy SEALs stationed nearby. It wasn't long before Alex began meeting them regularly. First, it was just basketball. Then workouts. Then late-night conversations about life, discipline, and choices. Chris, the tall one with calm authority, became a mentor. Jake, quick-witted and fierce, became like an older brother. Two others, Marcus and Leo, drifted in and out as deployments shifted. To Alex, they weren't superheroes. They were men who had lived through storms, carried scars both visible and invisible, and still stood tall. And in their strength, Alex found direction. He started to change. His grades improved. His discipline sharpened. He stopped letting the HOA's harassment eat at him. And me? For the first time in years, I saw pride in his posture. So when the SEALs had leave, where did they go? To Vegas? Miami? Beaches and bars? No, they came here. To Lot 42. Because for them, Alex wasn't just a kid. He was a reminder of why they served in the first place. The next generation. The future. They didn't see a suburb with HOA politics. They saw a boy they could help mold into a man. And so they visited. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without needing to explain themselves to anyone. Until Karen noticed. Chris leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His steady gaze locked on the chaos outside. Jake adjusted his jacket, smirking faintly. "They don't know what to do with us," Jake muttered. "They'll figure it out," Chris replied evenly. Alex sat on the couch, shoulders tense. "I hate this," he said quietly. "They think you're criminals. They don't know who you are." Chris crouched down in front of him, his voice calm, steady. "Alex, doesn't matter what they think. We know who we are. You know who we are. Truth doesn't need their permission." Alex nodded, swallowing hard. His eyes glistened with frustration but also something else, respect. It struck me then. This was why they were here. Not just to visit. Not just to relax. They were teaching Alex lessons Karen could never grasp. Karen believed power came from control. From clipboards, fines, and threats. The SEALs showed Alex something different. That power came from discipline. From calm in the storm. From standing tall when others tried to tear you down. And tonight, he was getting that lesson firsthand. Through the blinds, I could see Karen still shouting at the officers. Her gestures wild, her voice desperate. If only she knew. If only she could see past her paranoia, she might have recognized the honor standing quietly in my living room. But Karen didn't see people. She saw threats, violations, enemies, and that blindness, it was about to be her undoing. "Chris," Alex asked softly, "do you ever get tired of people not understanding you?" Chris gave a small smile. "All the time." "So what do you do?" "We don't waste energy on people like that," Chris said simply. "We focus on the mission, the people who matter, the ones who do understand." Jake chimed in, smirking. "And sometimes we let idiots hang themselves with their own rope. Like your HOA queen out there." Alex chuckled weakly. The tension in his shoulders eased a little. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was a defining moment in my son's life. He wasn't just watching how Navy SEALs handled conflict. He was learning how to handle his own battles. The officers outside were growing restless. Their radios crackled. Neighbors murmured. The balance of power was shifting fast. And Karen? She didn't know it yet, but she was about to face her greatest humiliation. Because the truth about who these men were wasn't just coming out. It was about to be broadcast to the entire neighborhood, clear and undeniable. And no amount of clipboards, fines, or lies could stop it. The night had settled into a tense standoff. The cops stood on my front porch, their radios crackling softly, their eyes shifting between me, the SEALs, and the furious woman still pacing on the curb. Neighbors leaned in, whispering, their phone cameras catching every flicker of drama. Karen's voice sliced through the tension like a siren. "Officers!" she barked, striding up the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Why are you standing around? Search the house. Drag those men out. This neighborhood is at risk." The lead officer raised a hand, his tone patient but firm. "Ma'am, I've told you." Karen cut him off. "Don't ma'am me. You're supposed to serve and protect, and right now you're failing. These men are a danger, and if you won't act, I'll make sure your department hears about it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Threatening the police? Even the most Karen of Karens rarely dared that. The lead officer shifted uncomfortably. His training told him to stay calm, to keep control. But his instincts were at war with the shrill demands drilling into his ear. "Sir," he said to me cautiously, "for the sake of resolving this, can your guests step outside so we can clear this up?" Before I could answer, Karen screeched again. "Yes, out with them. Now." Her voice cracked, desperate, like a gambler who'd bet everything on one last roll. Chris moved first. Calm, deliberate. His boots thudded softly against the wooden floor as he walked past me and onto the porch. Jake followed, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning every corner of the crowd. The neighborhood fell into a hush. The flashing red and blue lights painted their faces in harsh shadows, highlighting their calm, disciplined presence. Chris didn't need to shout. His very posture commanded attention. Karen's smug grin returned for a heartbeat. "See? Look at them. Tattoos, military gear, bags. They're mercenaries, I told you." But her triumph lasted only seconds. Chris reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, pulled out his credentials, and held them up to the nearest officer. The golden seal of the United States Navy caught the light. "Petty Officer Christopher Hale, United States Navy SEALs," he said firmly. "This is my teammate, Petty Officer Jacob Rivers. We're here visiting family friends." The crowd gasped. Phones zoomed in closer. Karen's face went pale, then flushed crimson. "Lies. Fakes. Anyone can print that on a computer. Don't be fooled." Her voice grew shriller, almost unhinged. "They're trying to intimidate you with costumes and props. Don't let them trick you. Arrest them." The officer studying the credentials frowned. He wasn't buying it. He wasn't dismissing it either. "These look official." "Official?" Karen shrieked. "Oh, please. They're criminals. Dangerous men. Do your jobs before they shoot someone." Jake chuckled softly, the sound dripping with calm confidence. "Ma'am, if we wanted to hurt someone, you wouldn't have seen us coming." The line sent a ripple through the crowd. Some neighbors gasped, others laughed nervously, but everyone knew one thing. Jake wasn't bluffing. Chris remained steady, eyes locked on the officers. "We are not criminals. We are not threats. But we will not be disrespected like this again. False reports waste your time, officer, and ours." The officer swallowed hard. His posture shifted, almost subconsciously more respectful. But Karen couldn't stand losing control. She marched right up to the porch, pointing her clipboard like a weapon. "You think you're above the law?" she shouted. "This is my neighborhood. I decide who belongs here. And you?" She jabbed her finger at Alex, who stood frozen in the doorway. "You're the reason this filth is here. You've brought shame and danger to us all." The crowd gasped again. Parents pulled their kids closer. Even some of Karen's old allies shook their heads in disgust. Alex's fists clenched, but Chris placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Don't," he whispered. That was it. The lead officer stepped forward, his voice booming. "Ma'am, that's enough. You are interfering with police business, disrupting the peace, and making baseless accusations. If you don't step back right now, you're the one who's going to be in handcuffs." Karen froze, eyes wide, her face a mask of outrage and disbelief. You'd arrest me? I'm the one protecting this community." "No," the officer shot back. "You're the one endangering it." The neighbors erupted in whispers, laughter, even applause. For the first time, the tide had completely turned. Unbelievable. She's lost it. Harassing Navy SEALs? What a joke. She's finished. Phones shook in laughter as neighbors recorded every word. Karen wasn't a hero anymore. She was the villain of her own story, unraveling in front of her audience. Chris stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Officer, I think we've tolerated enough slander tonight. My teammates and I don't want trouble. But we also won't allow ourselves, or Alex, to be treated like criminals in our own country." Jake added with a smirk, "Frankly, ma'am, if we were half as dangerous as you keep screaming, this would have been over before you called 911. Laughter rippled through the crowd again. Karen's face twisted, caught between fury and humiliation. Karen tried one last time, her voice breaking. "You'll all regret this. When something terrible happens, don't come crying to me." But no one listened anymore. Not the neighbors. Not the cops. Not even the kids who used to avoid her wrath. Her power, built on fear and control, had crumbled. The officers exchanged looks. The crowd buzzed. The SEALs stood firm, radiating authority. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a turning point. And soon, the truth about Karen's lies, and the HOA's abuse of power, would come crashing down in a way no one could ignore. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, laughter, and gasps. But for the first time that night, the power was shifting decisively. The officers stood straighter, no longer glancing nervously at Chris and Jake like they might be threats, but studying them with the recognition of men who understood real authority. And in the middle of it all, Karen stood frozen. Her once triumphant smirk was gone, replaced with the wide-eyed panic of someone who realized the show she had staged was no longer hers to control. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, Mr. Rivers, may I confirm these credentials?" Chris nodded calmly. "Of course, officer. That's your duty. Call it in." He handed over the wallet with a practiced motion, confident and unbothered. The officer stepped aside, speaking into his radio, his tone clipped and respectful now. The crowd leaned forward, phones raised higher, waiting for the verdict. The moments stretched, thick with tension. Karen couldn't stand the silence. "You don't need to check. They're fakes. I told you. They're criminals playing dress-up. If you fall for this, you're failing this community." Her shrill voice only drew more eye rolls and muffled laughter from the neighbors. And then the officer's radio crackled back. His shoulders straightened. His expression changed. He turned to the crowd, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Confirmed. These men are active-duty Navy SEALs." The block erupted. Gasps, cheers, laughter. Half the neighborhood burst into applause, while the other half whispered frantically into their phones, already posting the update online. "SEALs? No way. She called the cops? On Navy SEALs? Oh my God. This is going viral." Alex's eyes shone with pride as he glanced at his mentors. For him, this wasn't just vindication. It was proof that the people he admired most weren't just strong in private, but respected everywhere. Karen's face drained of color. She shook her head violently, stumbling a step back. No, that's impossible. They're lying. You're lying." The lead officer fixed her with a cold stare. "Ma'am, we've confirmed their identities. They are who they say they are, which means everything you've reported tonight was false." The words landed like a hammer. Karen stammered, waving her clipboard helplessly. I didn't mean. I was just..." I was protecting. Protecting? One of the neighbors interrupted, their voice sharp. You just tried to get Navy SEALs arrested because you don't like them visiting Alex. That's not protecting. That's harassment. The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone even shouted, "Step down, Karen," drawing laughter and cheers. The officers no longer looked tense. They looked annoyed. The lead officer crossed his arms. "Ma'am, you've wasted our time and resources on a false report. Do you understand the seriousness of that?" Karen sputtered, her voice cracking. But the neighborhood, the safety. I was doing my duty." Chris's calm voice cut through her excuses. "Your duty? Harassing a teenager and wasting police time because you don't like who his friends are? That's not duty, Mrs. Henderson. That's abuse of authority." And then, to everyone's surprise, Alex stepped forward. His voice was steady, louder than I'd ever heard it before. "You've been targeting me since the day we moved here. My lawn, my basketball hoop, my skateboard, even my lemonade stand. And now you call the cops because my friends came to visit." His eyes locked on Karen's. "You don't care about safety. You just care about control." The neighbors gasped, then clapped. The teenager she'd bullied for years was finally standing up to her, and with half the neighborhood watching. Karen's lips quivered, but no words came out. The officer returned Chris's credentials, his voice respectful. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. You're free to go about your evening." Chris nodded calmly. "No apology needed, officer. You did your job." He cast a glance at Karen. "Some people just don't know when to stop." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the officer wasn't finished. "Ma'am, you're lucky we're not charging you tonight, but this will go on record. And if you make another false report like this again, there will be consequences." The clipboard trembled in her hands. The crowd cheered again, louder this time, the sound swelling like a wave. Humiliated, Karen stumbled back toward her house. The phones followed her every step, recording her defeat for posterity. No matter how many excuses she'd try later, nothing could erase what everyone had just witnessed. She vanished into her house, slamming the door so hard it echoed down the street. But the damage was done. Her reign of fear, of fines, of threats. It had cracked wide open in front of the entire neighborhood. As the officers returned to their cars and the crowd began to disperse, Chris clapped a hand on Alex's shoulder. "You handled yourself well tonight." Alex exhaled, his face still tight with adrenaline. "I was scared, but I wasn't gonna let her win." Jake smirked. "That's the point, kid. Fear's always there. It's what you do with it that counts." I watched my son stand taller than I'd ever seen him before. For years, Karen had chipped away at him with petty rules and constant suspicion. Tonight, she hadn't just lost to the SEALs. She'd lost to him. But even as the lights faded and the crowd thinned, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her never walked away quietly. This humiliation would fester. She'd scheme, plot, look for another way to claw back her power. But after tonight, she'd never hold this neighborhood the same way again. Because once the truth is revealed, once the masks fall, fear loses its grip. And Karen's grip had shattered. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like a hive. Word of what happened the night before spread faster than wildfire. By sunrise, it wasn't just whispers. It was headlines in group chats, gossip threads, and Facebook posts. Clips of Karen screaming at Navy SEALs were already circulating online. The once feared queen of the HOA was now the neighborhood's biggest joke. 2 days later, the HOA board scrambled to hold a meeting. Karen had called it herself, trying desperately to reassert authority after the fiasco. She walked into the community hall wearing her usual pastel cardigan and pearls, chin high, pretending nothing had happened. But her usual confidence was gone. Every whisper, every snicker, every sideways glance chipped at her armor. She banged her gavel. "Order, order. This meeting will come to order." But instead of the obedient silence she expected, chuckles rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Better call the cops again." Laughter followed. Karen's cheeks flushed. "Now, she began, her voice sharp. We must discuss last week's incident. Clearly, there were misunderstandings, and certain individuals in this community are attempting to twist the truth. A hand shot up in the back. Mr. Lopez, one of her longtime supporters. Karen, he said flatly. The whole neighborhood saw what happened. You called the police on Navy SEALs. Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Karen stammered. I was protecting the community. Protecting us from what? Veterans? Another neighbor scoffed. If anything, we were safer with them here than with you screaming on the curb. For years, Karen had ruled the HOA with fear. But now the fear was gone. Mrs. Dalton, usually one of Karen's allies, raised her voice. I've lived here 20 years, Karen, and I've never been more embarrassed. Do you realize my granddaughter saw that video online? She asked me why grown adults act crazier than kids. Karen gripped her clipboard tighter. That video was taken out of context. No, Mr. Lopez cut in. That was the context. You humiliated yourself. And you humiliated us. The board members exchanged glances. The silent unity Karen once commanded was crumbling right before her eyes. Then came the moment Karen didn't expect. I move, Mr. Lopez said loudly, that we hold a vote of no confidence in Karen Henderson as HOA president. The room erupted. Some cheered. Some gasped. Karen slammed her gavel on the table. Outrageous. You can't. But she was wrong. They could. And they did. Hands rose around the room, one after another, until nearly the entire board and half the audience signaled their agreement. Karen's jaw fell open. For years, she had silenced dissent with intimidation. Now no one feared her. The motion carried. You ungrateful hypocrites, she shrieked. After everything I've done for this neighborhood, you'd turn on me over one mistake. Karen, Mrs. Dalton said coldly. It wasn't one mistake. It was years of bullying. Last week was just the final straw. The room fell silent at that. Karen's face twisted, her clipboard trembling in her hands. For a moment, she looked less like a queen and more like a cornered animal. Then, with a furious screech, she hurled the clipboard onto the table and stormed out. The door slammed behind her, rattling the windows. And just like that, her reign was over. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt lighter. Kids rode bikes freely without Karen chasing them off the sidewalks. Parents chatted in their yards without fear of fines for loitering. Lawns weren't inspected with military precision. For the first time, people felt like they actually lived in a community instead of a dictatorship. And Alex? He walked taller. Neighbors who once scolded him now patted his back, telling him, "Good for you, kid. You handled yourself better than most adults would have." The SEALs didn't brag. They didn't need to. Their calm presence had spoken louder than any shouting ever could. As for Karen, she vanished. Curtains drawn, car unmoved, her once daily patrols replaced with eerie silence. But the truth was, she didn't need to patrol anymore. Her power was gone. And though everyone suspected she was plotting her comeback, writing letters, drafting complaints, searching for ways to claw her way back into control, no one cared. Because the neighborhood had seen behind the curtain. And you can't unsee the truth. Watching all this unfold, I realized something profound. Karen's humiliation wasn't just about one night. It was the collapse of years of fear and control. She had built her kingdom on intimidation. But kingdoms built on fear crumble the second people stop being afraid. And with one false call, one wild accusation, she had destroyed herself. The neighborhood was never quite the same after that night. The echoes of flashing lights, angry shouts, and the stunning reveal of Navy SEALs living quietly in our home lingered in everyone's memory. But more than that, the lesson lingered. Karen's clipboard no longer haunted the sidewalks. The HOA still existed, but stripped of her iron grip, it was suddenly normal. They focused on landscaping budgets, pool hours, and neighborhood barbecues instead of witch hunts. People laughed more freely at block parties. Kids played basketball in driveways without fear of fines. And the air felt lighter, freer. For the first time in years, it felt like home. But the biggest change wasn't in the neighborhood, it was in Alex. That night had tested him. He'd been accused, humiliated, targeted in front of his peers and neighbors. Yet instead of crumbling, he had stood tall. In the days after, I saw a new confidence in him. He spoke louder, looked people in the eye, carried himself with the kind of quiet strength I recognized instantly. It mirrored the seals he admired. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses, he sat on the porch with Chris. "Was I brave?" he asked hesitantly. Chris gave him a small smile. "Bravery isn't about not being afraid, Alex. It's about standing your ground when fear tries to push you back. And you did that. You faced her without running. That's what matters." Alex beamed, and for the first time I knew he truly believed in himself. The Navy SEALs didn't stay long. Duty called them back to service. But before they left behind something more valuable than their presence. "Remember this, Alex?" Jake said as he loaded his bag into the truck. "There will always be people who want to control you, to make you feel small. But their power only works if you let it. The moment you stand up, they lose everything." It wasn't a lecture. It was a gift, and I knew Alex would carry it with him for the rest of his life. As for Karen, she remained holed up in her house, curtains drawn, too embarrassed to show her face. The last I heard, she had resigned from the HOA completely, citing stress and unfair treatment. But the truth was clear. Her reign was over. The woman who once ruled with fines and fear had been undone by her own arrogance. Her clipboard, once a symbol of power, had become a punchline. In a way, I almost pitied her. Almost. Because while she obsessed over rules and control, she missed the real point of a community: trust, respect, and belonging. Weeks later, at the first HOA meeting without Karen, something remarkable happened. Instead of scowls and complaints, people laughed. Instead of fear, there was camaraderie. Someone suggested a neighborhood cookout. Another proposed a basketball tournament for the kids. And no one objected. For the first time, our HOA wasn't about rules. It was about neighbors. Standing on my porch one quiet evening, I thought back to the chaos of that night. The flashing lights, the shouting, the tension. Karen had thought she was teaching us a lesson. That power belonged to those who shouted the loudest, who clutched rules the tightest. But in the end, it wasn't her voice that echoed. It was Alex's. Calm, steady, unshaken. The HOA had called the cops on my son, thinking they'd expose trouble. Instead, they exposed themselves. Entitlement may win battles in the short term. Clipboards, fines, and false accusations can scare people for a while. But respect, the kind earned through honor, service, and integrity, wins the war. And sometimes, all it takes to topple entitlement is the courage of one teenager standing tall, backed by the quiet strength of friends who know what real power looks like.